I'm Martez Reed, Director of Technical Marketing with Morpheus Data. We're going to walk through some Kubernetes stuff. Everyone loves Kubernetes. Let's talk about it. From a Morpheus standpoint, so certainly when we talk about Kubernetes, oftentimes there's a number of players in the space. And one of the things that Morpheus looks to really provide is that unified platform. And so when we start talking about hybrid IT and heterogeneous environments, it's the idea that everybody's going to consume some public cloud and going to move to Kubernetes. But what happens to those workloads that are still on-prem or always going to be on-prem, as well as the workloads that just don't make sense from a Kubernetes standpoint? So certainly the common one that comes up is Java applications that some people talk about is, are you really going to stuff your very large Java application into a container, or are you really going to try and run these very massive Windows containers? Some people have tried it, love it, enjoy it. Some people decided, you know what, that's not the path for us. And so being able to provide both those options in terms of modality, as well as management in the single platform is really a major value proposition of the Morpheus platform. Certainly we're seeing things in terms of adoption of Kubernetes or cloud native, moving back essentially into the VM space with projects like KubeVirt and various others. And so how do you manage both of those worlds effectively? So that's where we're at. And so typically when we talk about Morpheus and as it relates to Kubernetes, we mentioned three things. So build, manage, and consume. When we mention build, we're referring to the ability to be able to build or provision a Kubernetes cluster from the Morpheus platform. And so the Morpheus platform itself has various hooks into automation, orchestration, hypervisors, public cloud, to be able to facilitate the stand-up of those Kubernetes workers as part of the process. And so the natural conclusion is going to be, we can just oftentimes leverage that same functionality to take advantage of the core use case of the Morpheus platform, but also start to facilitate the automation of management of Kubernetes clusters. So the Morpheus platform supports the ability to be able to provision AKS, EKS, as well as GKE Kubernetes clusters from the platform. So cloud managed Kubernetes offerings from AWS, Azure, as well as GCP within the platform. In addition to that, there's the ability to deploy the Morpheus Kubernetes Service Kubernetes Distribution, or MKS. So that is a Kubernetes distribution that is effectively a vanilla Kubernetes distribution with some common community or open source add-ins, things like Prometheus, Grafana, oftentimes the things that are commonly added as part of Kubernetes distributions. And what this provides is the ability to be able to deploy a Kubernetes cluster quickly out of the box, either on-prem or in the public cloud. As we saw, the Morpheus platform supports integration with dozens of clouds to be able to deploy into those environments. So it really simplifies that deployment of those clusters. Third-party Kubernetes clusters, which I'm going to walk through the demo a little bit later, is taking advantage of Morpheus's integrations into public clouds, private clouds, as well as the ability to facilitate automation. We can start to build out Kubernetes clusters, whether it's a K3S or a K0S, various scenarios we're able to build out from a platform standpoint, because oftentimes at its core, it's really focused on being able to provision those workloads, and workload provisioning is a core aspect of the Morpheus platform. And then finally, the ability to bring existing Kubernetes clusters into the platform from a management standpoint. So technically, it's not building the Kubernetes cluster, but oftentimes that's the next question that people ask when we get to the build section is, it's great that you do that, but I've got existing Kubernetes clusters. And so we've included here, just for simplicity purposes, but it really starts to paint the picture of both the ability to be able to build out those Kubernetes clusters and then be able to also ingest those Kubernetes clusters that may not have been provisioned directly through Morpheus.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Ask away.
Excellent. All right. So you want to go back one slide?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So for the cloud managed Kubernetes options, is that something where I have to write a Terraform configuration or something along those lines and then feed that into Morpheus to provision it? Or is that already baked in and it's just hitting drop downs to say, this is the size, cluster, number of nodes, et cetera?
Yep, it is the latter. And so the way we're able to facilitate that and accomplish that is through the cloud integrations that we have. So being able to, as a core component of the Morpheus platform, we have the integrations with clouds like AWS, Azure, GCP. And so essentially that just simply piggybacks off of those integrations that we have and makes those additional API calls to spin up those clusters as part of the platform. Certainly as another option, there's the ability to take advantage of the various other pieces of automation that the platform supports. So if you decided, you know what, I do want to do this via Terraform, Morpheus does have support for Terraform to be able to deploy those Kubernetes clusters. Also, you could utilize PowerShell or Python or whatever your automation tool of choice is to be able to spin up those Kubernetes clusters.
Right, but you have the out of the box. I can just
out of the box
interface.
Add the cloud. Say you want to provision a cluster, AKS, EKS, GKE, hit a few drop downs, and away it goes.
Okay, all right, and it has support for some of the stranger features that each of those native implementations have. Like if I want to use the internal load balancer or the application gateway on AKS, I can just specify that, right?
So at the moment, we've got the core set of functionality. That's an area where we're continuing to advance and develop, is some of those more specific aspects of those integrations. And so, which is certainly where you get into, if the core functionality features are sufficient, leverage that functionality, but there is also the ability, as we mentioned, Terraform, Python, whatever it might be to fit that specific need.
Okay. What about OpenShift? Because I don't see it on here.
OpenShift. So we do actually have customers deploying OpenShift clusters from a platform standpoint. It is not a native integration to the platform. And even at the moment, OpenShift is revamping how they even deploy OpenShift clusters with their assisted installer. So there's certainly the ability to take advantage of, as I mentioned, with Morpheus's ability to have hooks into the hypervisors, as well as the public clouds, as well as the automation to tie that together and stitch that together from a functionality standpoint. And then we will also be able to import that from a management standpoint. Any CNCF conformant Kubernetes cluster can be managed by the Morpheus platform.
All right, awesome.
And to that point, management. The other aspect of the Morpheus platform is the ability to be able to gain visibility and insights into Kubernetes cluster from a visibility standpoint. So as we mentioned, the ability to be able to build various Kubernetes clusters. Parallel to that, the ability to be able to get visibility into various Kubernetes clusters. So if you are running, and this is where it goes back to the major value proposition of the Morpheus platform, is the vendor agnostic nature of the platform. So whether I'm deploying cloud managed or OpenShift or Tanzu or K3S or whatever it might be from a Kubernetes distribution standpoint, there's the ability to bring that into the platform from a management standpoint. So getting visibility and insight into those clusters from things like CPU, memory, storage, performance metrics, also the ability to be able to get and pull in the objects within the Kubernetes cluster itself, be able to interact and interface with those from a management standpoint. And then also, once again, another value proposition of the Morpheus platform is it does have the built-in automation engine. And so commonly there are tasks from a day two standpoint, or even we talked about provisioning that I might want to leverage in terms of the maintenance of my Kubernetes clusters. And so there's that added value there in which it's that unified platform from a capability standpoint. And then the last one is consume. So we talked about build, talked about manage, and now we're consuming Kubernetes clusters. We saw a little bit of this in the previous session. Really, it provides a number of opportunities for us to be able to interact and interface with the Kubernetes cluster. One of the things from the Morpheus platform standpoint is really focused on self-service. And so for us, the ability to be able to have something like an application catalog, where there are commonly used applications or oftentimes add-ons, quote unquote, depending upon how you view those, that can be added to the Kubernetes cluster via the Morpheus self-service catalog. And those can be deployed either via native Kubernetes manifest or utilizing essentially a third-party tool like Helm for a deployment. In addition to that, the blueprinting capabilities within the Morpheus platform allow the stitching together of objects. Oftentimes it's VMs or instances that are being stitched together, but the platform does also provide that flexibility to stitch together non-VM or non-Kubernetes workloads, as well as Kubernetes workloads. And we're starting to see more and more of this as an industry with the advent of things like service mesh to be able to tie those aspects together, as well as things like workload identity to be able to facilitate that interaction and communication with those workloads. And so it provides a way to be able to start stitching together the VM-based workloads or the bare metal workloads into the Kubernetes workloads as part of a simplified deployment or provisioning of those workloads. And then in addition to that, once again, going back to the automation piece of the platform, being able to piggyback or tie in automation to the back of a deployment. And so when we start to think about things that are being deployed into Kubernetes clusters, oftentimes there's external hooks that need to be facilitated, whether it is something like to a cloud environment or somewhere else in the IT environment that's not native to the Kubernetes cluster. In most environments, Kubernetes does not live in a silo. And so given that it doesn't live in a silo in and of itself, how can we facilitate those interactions or integrations with other aspects of our IT environment? So now we're going to take a quick look through the platform from a demo standpoint. So certainly feel free to jump in and ask any questions as we go along.
On the applications catalog there,
Yep.
Are they users supplying those?
Yes.
Can you write your own, or is there any community contributions? No.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It would be the user creating their own content, but there is some content that is included out of the box from the platform standpoint. So seated in the platform, so things like the Nginx and Apache, but certainly users could bring and create their own. In addition to that, we do have a burgeoning community that is continuing to develop content and beginning to share.
Yeah, real quick on that, we also do provide like common images and keep those up to date. Like Ubuntu 22 just recently came out. We provide that as a catalog item for you out of the box with some of the standard ones. And if it's cloud native, we reference their provided marketplace images. So we do keep that up to date for you as well.
And do they come with the platform version upgrades, or can they be independently updated?
Independently.
Okay, so you don't have to upgrade the whole platform to get the new.
Right, and that's a newer thing that kind of ties into our plugins and packages. So we do offer them with our Morpheus appliance upgrades, but you also can apply new technologies to the existing version via our plugin architecture as well as our packages.
Okay, and how are versions tracked in terms of functionality levels? You know, is there minimum set version?
Yeah.
Plugin. Relatively simple.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Good. Thank you.
Is there anything like a Morpheus registry?
Yeah, we actually just started the share.morpheus data. I think we released it about a month ago.
Okay.
It's pretty new.
Yeah.
But we've got a lot of cool stuff in there. Martez has actually done a Datadog plugin in there. There's been some customer stuff in our community forums with Psychotic, and you'll see a Crowdin for localization. So there's a lot of stuff. We're starting to build that out. We're seeing a lot of activity there. So
nice.
Very excited to see that grow.
Where do you place yourself, like small business, large companies, companies that are at the beginning of their cloud journey and more established? So could you tell me a bit more what companies you're already working with, where you're deployed in the market?
Yeah, so our mix is about 65%, I'd say large enterprise, 35% service provider. And so service providers could be small regional, data center hosting providers, and Volta is one here in the US. We've got Expedient, good size one. Love to talk to Island.
I don't know.
So some other global ones, though, I mentioned BT and others. So service providers is a big focus for us, and obviously a lot of the platform relates to that. But yeah, pretty much large enterprise, mostly because we see kind of this inflection point where the size of your IT team is being outpaced by the demand for provisioning and workload management. If you've got 50 VMs that are pretty static and you're not getting hit to deploy a lot, you could probably muscle your way through. If you've got 5,000 VMs and it's doubled in the last 2 years, and you're thinking about containers and Kubernetes, and someone else is asking you to manage a public cloud, you desperately need a better way to wrangle that environment. So it just behooves itself for kind of that larger enterprise. Also, a tightly regulated industry. We haven't talked about it. We kind of skimmed right past it. We're not a SaaS managed control plane, right? In terms of workload affinity. And most of the workloads on the planet are still running on-prem. Most of our customers want their control plane on-prem as well, and we'll reach back out into the public cloud. That said, we've got a lot of the service providers who will run us up in AWS or Azure, even use some of the cloud native backed services to manage the discrete service tiers of Morpheus itself. You can deploy it as an all-in-one, or you can fully externalize all those services and run them in scale out clusters. So it's a very flexible install package.
And to that point, platform is installable on a Linux distribution, right now VMs, but certainly one of the items on the roadmap is being able to deploy it into Kubernetes as part of what we're looking to do moving forward. Speaking of Kubernetes clusters. So within the platform, we mentioned the ability to be able to build or provision Kubernetes clusters as part of the native functionality of the platform. So clicking the drop down within the platform, I get presented with a handful of options: AKS, EKS, GKE, Kubernetes cluster, the ability to bring in external Kubernetes clusters, handful of options within the platform. And so as an example, go to start provisioning an EKS cluster as part of the platform. So this is leveraging the integration that this particular Morpheus installation has into AWS. So that particular integration has been created to the cloud account. And so now we're simply piggybacking off of that connectivity and then leveraging that for our API calls. Provided with the name. And then now I have a handful of options. So I can select certain layouts or certain versions of EKS. And then to Ned's point, the ability to go into those drop downs and select certain options, certain items that I want from an EKS standpoint. So we'll select a handful of the options here as we go through. So certainly there's the large list of options that are presented back, depending upon what I have access to as part of the deployment process. And once again, there is an API. So if my desire is not to go through each of these drop downs as part of the process, I can script this, either the REST API or the Morpheus CLI.
I should also mention you can set defaults as well, so you don't have to select all these. But in the demo environment, we have a lot of options.
All right, I'll click next. I'm fast. So similar, one of the things we see is workflow capabilities. So once again, being able to leverage that automation functionality within the platform is certainly a possibility. So one of the things that we see here is the summary of what we're about to deploy. And we do see that there is a price or cost associated with this particular Kubernetes cluster based upon what I'm about to deploy. So I do see that this particular Kubernetes cluster that I'm about to deploy, it's $194 a month for this particular cloud managed Kubernetes service offering. So I'm not paying for it, so I'll click complete.
Is it just pulling list price for that? Or can you configure the costing based off of any discounts you're receiving, stuff like that?
David?
That depends on the cloud. So on-prem, you have complete control over it. On Azure, you get your ELA or your CSP pricing. GCP, you also get your enterprise pricing. AWS, you still get just the list price at the moment. And that's a limitation of their APIs at the time of creation.
It's AWS, I understand.
Just a quick question, and obviously it's easy enough to work out the cost there on the AWS side against the machine you're deploying. If you were deploying that on something on premise, is there any way to assign a cost or form that chargeback reporting internally within the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the platform includes the native costing for on-prem, whether it's OpenStack, Nutanix, vSphere. And so we're going to model that data and represent that when we're deploying the cluster, if it happens to be on-prem. So in the case of our MKS Kubernetes distribution, that cost will show when we go to deploy it. All right, so in this case, we want to provision an MKS cluster as an example. So this would be what we do for whether it's public cloud, private cloud. We could deploy this Morpheus included Kubernetes distribution. So in this case, I want to deploy it into a vSphere cluster. And I'm presented with a handful of options to be able to deploy various versions. So I'll select 1.23, various plans that I can associate with it. And so to that point, we start to see pricing associated with my VMware vSphere environment. It's very tiny, but it's $44 a month. And so because we do provide that functionality with our standard provisioning, so to speak, we can bring that in when we deploy Kubernetes clusters as well. So I have a handful of options similar to what we saw when we deployed EKS. I can click next, finish, and away it'll go start deploying. You can also import existing Kubernetes clusters as part of what we provide from the platform standpoint to get insight and visibility into the platform. So I would specify where I want to have it reside from a cloud standpoint for a number of reasons from a management standpoint. And then provide a handful of inputs in terms of things like, where's the Kubernetes cluster? How do I get to the Kubernetes cluster from an authentication standpoint as part of the process as well? So that was the bit of the provision. One of the other things is, as I mentioned, the ability to be able to start deploying various third-party Kubernetes clusters. So in this case, I want to actually deploy a K3S cluster. So I can leverage Morpheus's capabilities. So this is a custom created catalog item, leveraging Morpheus's hooks into hypervisors, public clouds, as well as automation functionality. And I can be able to spin this up, whether it is on-prem, a vSphere environment, Nutanix, public cloud, AWS, Azure, GCP, whatever it might be, because I've got the hooks into all of those particular environments utilizing Morpheus's integrations. So jumping back to our clusters, so we'll pick on this cluster. So starting to get visibility and insights into the cluster after it's been deployed. So that's the managed piece. How can I see what's going on? How can I poke around in terms of what's going on in the Kubernetes cluster itself and start to make some decisions and get some insight in there? So certainly a number of options in terms of being able to get the visibility from a metric standpoint, CPU, storage, network. Also be able to see, in this case, it's been deployed through Morpheus, interact with the nodes themselves, be able to run given automation as part of the process. We could see various workloads that have been deployed as well. We can double click into the workloads themselves and get some additional information. So things like the status, get logging information, get granular information as far as the metrics, also be able to interact with those workloads. So let's say if I wanted to be able to change or modify the particular Kubernetes object, I have the ability to be able to do that as well.
Do you have to install anything on the Kubernetes cluster for Morpheus to be able to collect this information and perform actions on it as like the daemon set or an operator?
Yeah, so there's a couple of options. Right now, there's the ability to install the Morpheus agent on the worker node itself to be able to facilitate some of that. Roadmap item is to be able to deploy a daemon set to the Kubernetes cluster to take advantage of aggregation of metrics that way. One of the things that you would lose is some of the ability of the automation aspects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Just a lot of the stuff you've shown, you actually don't have to install anything on the cluster. It's when you start getting into the metrics and statistics to where you do need to install something on that cluster. Either it's our MKS agent, like you mentioned, or an operator daemon set. But as far as manipulating the objects or inventorying those objects, that's all done.
You just go through the API.
Through the API.
Right. Okay.
So a quick question that I wanted to ask basically was that, say, for example, if there's an organization, they haven't used Morpheus for whatever reason to deploy a Kubernetes cluster, or in fact, in general, and in AWS account for that matter, right? They have their own processes to create it. Are there mechanisms to actually auto-discover those kind of things? So a cluster got created and it's just polling or something and you're discovering them.
Yep, so as part of the initial configuration of my cloud, I have the ability to do things like discover existing workloads and bring them into the environment as well. So yeah, it's good. Discovery options. So that's a major benefit of the platform. And I can also leave those as simply discovered or be able to bring those essentially into the fold and manage those through Morpheus platform.
So is it just a matter of polling every now and then, or is it based on tags? How does it actually discover the clouds? Are there any requirements?
So that does depend a little bit on the cloud, but it is a polling-based system in a lot of environments. So basically, it does a keep alive with the various cloud APIs, and periodically, I think the default is every 5 minutes for a default install. It will ask the cloud for any additional data, and we'll do a state sync. And that includes everything from networks, subnets, VMs, all that stuff. It doesn't vary.
Okay.
And clusters.
Thank you.
You obviously need to maintain credentials and access to the likes of AWS. Do you provide any JSON templates that we can allocate to a policy to restrict access?
Yeah, so it actually, for the AWS credential side for managing things, it supports IAM policies as well as ARNs or impersonate kind of thing, like role ARNs if you want to like switch permissions from an STS assume role perspective. It also supports storing those credentials externally in Vault, referencing them as well.
Okay.
So some of the things as you're doing the demo, I know have comparable features on the individual cloud side. So like groups and resource groups, tags and tags, like how much of what I deploy here actually that is not a configuration makes it over to those cloud resources, or do they at all? Or do they come in, for instance, if you're discovering things, will it bring in that this VM is in this resource group in Azure, or it has these tags on it?
Yes, it will. If we're talking about vCenter, for example, it'll do your tags and your categories. It'll do your annotations and notes, and it'll actually sync those as wiki pages with markdown processing if you want.
Mhm.
All that state data is changed. So if you change it on the Morpheus side, it's automatically propagated to the cloud. If you change it on the cloud, after that pull happens, it's synced back as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about service discovery also.
Yeah, that'd be great. And so will you be showing us anything on the cloud sides so that we could see what happens over there? Or is that something I schedule for another meeting?
I haven't really scheduled that one. I would have to see if we can, I don't have it set up right now. I mean,
Oh, that's
I
fair.
avoid being in the cloud now that I have Morpheus. I hardly ever have to open the cloud consoles anymore. So
I hear you. I hear you. So that's great. Thank you.